Haha! Good evening everyone, I am Leon Lamont and I'm Bob Loaf. First on tonight's story, violent and impulsive behaviour, nature or nurture. These two geneticists believe the former. Here's Neil Burkett with the story. Impulsive behaviour is associated with many neuropsychiatric disorders and most frequently constitutes suicidal behaviour, substance abuse, binge eating and a range of personality disorders including ADHD, which is strongly associated with violent criminality. So, what have you got to say about the causes of impulsivity, Dr. Grasswitch and Dr. Steenbun?
With genetic studies of this subject increasing, we have found several positive relationships between genetic variants and impulsivity. This is particularly the case for genes involved in serotonin, a neurotransmitter regarded as a chemical responsible for maintaining mood balance, and dopaminergic pathways. Dopamine is another neurotransmitter involved in many bodily functions, including mood, behavior, and cognition. Early studies have concluded that impulsive behavior is associated with impaired frontal lobe and serotonergic function.
So you have said that links have been found between impulsiveness and serotonin and dopamine, but can you give us more details about how they work in the brain?
Well, dopamine is involved in the processing of goal-directed and motivated behavior as per its innervations in certain regions of the brain. And serotoninergic neurons project throughout the brain, including the prefrontal cortex. Hence, impulsive behavior may be due to chemical-induced changes in this region, specifically the dysfunction of the 5-HT neurotransmissions in the central nervous system.
What is 5-HT?
Well, 5-HT are a group of G protein-coupled receptors and ligand-gated ion channels in which the natural ligand is serotonin. These receptors are found in both the central and peripheral nervous systems and mediate both excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmission. And tryptophan is an essential amino acid that acts as a precursor to serotonin synthesis. It has been demonstrated that an acute tryptophan depletion decreases 5-HT neurotransmission and subsequently increases impulsive behaviors.
So what about dopamine?
In recent studies, researchers have shown that changing dopamine levels in dopaminergic areas in the brain affect impulse control. For example, administering dopamine receptor antagonists appears to increase impulsive behavior. Therefore, natural variations in the gene regulating the 5-HT dopamine circuits may be the underlying cause.
So if impulsiveness has a genetic basis, is it inheritable?
A constant proportion of behavioral control and impulsive traits is explained by genetic factors as evidenced by studies on families. For example, studies have found that children who have first-degree relatives diagnosed with a depressive disorder are more likely to have OCD. It is estimated that 30 to 40% of impulsiveness is explained by genetic factors and hence heritable.
So how are you testing for genetic variation associated with impulsiveness?
We test for genetic variations in individuals through molecular techniques. When examining specific genes, differences in allele distribution between affected and healthy individuals may be found. This is called an association study.
Yeah. And the most common method of choosing genes to be tested is called the functional candidate approach, where genes are selected based on their probable involvement in the disorder. Linkage studies can also be used, and these test a large number of markers to locate genes of liability in certain chromosomal areas. This is called the positional candidate approach.
So what contributing genes are we specifically looking at here in relation to impulsivity?
One class is serotoninergic genes. Each of the three genes that code for SCRT, TPH1, and TPH2 have been associated with at least two of the following traits: violent suicide, aggressive contact disorder, deliberate self-harm, ADHD, and cluster B personality disorders, which are all characterized by dramatic, overly emotional, or unpredictable thinking or behavior.
SCRT is a protein responsible for the reuptake of serotonin in the presynaptic axon and is hence involved in serotonin levels and its system's function. The gene TPH1 codes for the rate-limiting enzyme in serotonin biosynthesis, affecting serotonin levels in the brain. TPH1 has been associated with 5-HIAA concentration, which is the main catabolic product of 5-HT, is in the cerebral spinal fluid of an extremely impulsive group of individuals, alcoholics and violent offenders. These levels were lower in non-violent Parkinsonists and healthy individuals.
The group of 5-HT serotonin receptors have four major types, including 2A, 1B, 2B, and 2C. There are all high levels of 2A receptors in the frontal cortex, which may affect impulsive behavior with postsynaptic activation. Higher binding with these particular receptors in this region of the brain has been associated with suicide in some studies.
Yep, and the gene coding for 2A is associated with ADHD, criminal behavior, and anger-related traits. A polymorphism is this receptor's gene promoter was investigated in a study where the participants of the polymorphic allele group was found to be more impulsive than those in the normal allele group.
The gene coding for 1B is associated with disorders such as ADHD and substance abuse. There hasn't been much study in the receptor 2C, but appears to be associated with deliberate self-harm and suicide.
Yep, and the stop codon in the 2B gene was associated with substance abuse and a risk of committing impulsive crimes such as homicide, batteries, and arsons. In the study on Finnish prisoners, in Finnish prison, it was found that the allele frequency of this gene was 1.5% in violent offenders and 0.6% among extremely violent offenders. It was higher in normal individuals with 1.6%.
So that was serotonin. Are there any other classes of genes?
There is the MAOA gene, which codes for the enzyme responsible for the breakdown of various monoamines, including 5-HT, norepinephrine, and dopamine. It is associated with drug abuse, antisocial traits, violent suicide, ADHD, and borderline personality disorder. A study on transgenic mice that lacked this gene was performed where impulsive aggressiveness was increased. The MAOA genotype was also strongly associated with impulsive traits in male psychiatric patients.
Finally, there are four dopaminergic genes which have each been shown to be associated with at least two of the following traits: novelty seeking, ADHD, pathological gambling, and social behavior. Tourette syndrome and drug and alcohol dependence as well. These genes code for dopamine receptor 2, D4, and dopamine transporter, which is responsible for the reuptake of dopamine in the presynaptic axon, and for the enzyme COMT, which is a participant in the degradation of catecholamines, including dopamine.
So to reiterate, there are 7 genes mostly associated with serotonergic systems and 4 genes associated with dopaminergic systems, which are correlated to impulsive-related behaviors.
So there we have it. Genetic investigation supports an involvement of serotonin and dopamine systems in impulsive behavior and related disorders. Genes may explain individual variability in behavioral control and risk for some psychiatric disorders, and is associated with higher risks of criminality, alcohol and substance abuse, and suicide. Thank you for being on the show tonight with us, Dr. Steenbun and Dr. Grasswich. Thank you to all the viewers for being with us tonight. Good night, Australia.